As the sun set over Ouagadougou and dust clouds drifted across the parched soil of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the precipice of a new era, a leader not forged in boardrooms or ballot boxes, but in the crucible of fire, betrayal, and foreign interference that had plagued his people for decades. And though he wore the uniform of a soldier and the face of defiance, within him churned the storm of a man haunted by enemies, who smiled behind diplomatic curtains and shook hands, with the same fingers that pulled the strings of unrest. A man who had come to learn that leadership in Africa was not simply about governance but about survival, amidst traps laid not by visible adversaries, but by the ghostly remnants of colonial empires that had never truly left, merely changed uniforms and tactics, evolving into corporate conglomerates, intelligence agencies, and international NGOs, whose aid was often barbed with hidden interests. The conspiracy he faced was not a figment of paranoia, but a coordinated network of influence that operated in boardrooms in Paris, security meetings in Brussels, and encrypted channels shared between agents embedded within local opposition groups, foreign journalists, and NGOs that reported democracy while financing destabilization campaigns. He knew this because he had seen the receipts, intercepted the calls, and witnessed the chaos sown in villages when rebels appeared armed with weapons traceable to NATO-linked stockpiles, their movements suspiciously synchronized with the arrival of so-called humanitarian missions, their propaganda echoing the very phrases once used to justify colonial mandates. And it was in this vortex of deception that Traoré realized his role was not merely to govern, but to defend the very essence of Burkinabe sovereignty from an enemy whose handshake was soft, but whose grip strangled economies, whose smile masked extraction, whose rhetoric of liberty came with contracts that chained the nation's resources to foreign banks and puppet regimes. In this inferno of post-colonial maneuvering, Traoré's battle intensified not only on the battlefield, where militants and mercenaries bled the borders thin, but within the ministries corrupted by years of French-backed governance. Technocrats who spoke with European accents and carried foreign passports, media outlets parroting headlines crafted in Paris, and opposition leaders who made secret visits to embassies under the guise of diplomacy while peddling their loyalty for funding and asylum. He confronted the terrible truth that the conspiracy did not need soldiers when it had bankers, didn't need tanks when it had treaties, didn't need coups when it had culture wars and economic warfare. And so he moved swiftly, decisively, shutting down military cooperation agreements that had long served as surveillance networks for French intelligence, expelling military attachés, suspending broadcast licenses for foreign media accused of psychological manipulation, and nationalizing mines that had for generations funneled gold and uranium out of the country without touching the hands of its rightful owners. This made him a target not only of international condemnation, but of digital misinformation storms, economic sanctions, and whispers of assassination. One night, a convoy of unknown origin was spotted near the border, intercepted with maps of presidential residences. Another day, false stories flooded Western press labeling him a tyrant, a populist, an authoritarian, despite never having turned his rifle on his people. And yet the narrative stuck because it came not from the people of Burkina Faso, but from elite media institutions long accustomed to defining African leadership through Eurocentric lenses, where resistance equaled instability and sovereignty was a threat to the global order rather than its fulfillment. Despite the maelstrom, Traoré persisted. He restructured security operations, integrated local militia under the Volontaires pour la Défense de la Patrie, VDP, forming a national self-defense fabric where villagers once terrorized now became sentinels of their soil, and while Western critics called it militia militarization, they ignored the alternative, that without local defense, the state would collapse into the vacuum the French once justified their presence for. Meanwhile, Traoré opened corridors of collaboration with nations that had long stood on the periphery of Western dominance: Turkey, Russia, Iran, and China, countries whose aid came with fewer lectures and more bulldozers, who asked for contracts, not compliance, and though critics labeled it alignment with autocrats, Traoré viewed it as strategic diversification, a break from the monopoly of Western conditionality. And through this maneuvering he began to rebuild what others had gutted, rail networks, power stations, arsenals stocked with weapons not traceable, to French manufacturing, and an intelligence service that reported to Burkina Faso, not the Élysée Palace. Yet his greatest weapon was not arms or alliances, but the awakening of the people themselves. He flooded the country with education campaigns on neo-colonialism, conducted village dialogues where elders spoke history forbidden in textbooks, encouraged films and songs that told the truth of the 1890s, the 1960s, and the betrayals of the post-independence era, and soon even school children could name the companies that drained their land, the treaties that had silenced their voices, the presidents who fell not by ballot but by bullet, orchestrated from afar, and in that awareness, a collective resistance formed, not of violence but of vision, a shared determination to reclaim, not just territory but narrative, to control not just borders but belief. The fourth current of this endless war took form in the isolation that followed his rebellion. He was uninvited from summits, barred from banking networks, his nation downgraded by financial institutions whose ratings depended not on data, but on geopolitics, and though Western embassies scaled down, their operatives did not disappear, they merely changed titles. From diplomat to consultant, from press attaché to cultural envoy, from peace builder to influencer. And still they moved through social media, through NGOs that arrived with grants but spread rumors, through pseudo-environmentalists who warned of deforestation while overlooking the ecological devastation caused by French oil firms. And though Traoré felt the pressure, his greatest fear was not death or economic collapse, but that the hearts of his people would once again believe the lie that they were incapable of ruling themselves. So he doubled down, not on slogans but on substance. He launched agricultural programs that cut food imports, invested in textile production that reduced French garment dumping, empowered tech students to build local apps that replaced Western, platforms prone to surveillance, and made sure his speeches, broadcast through village loudspeakers and mobile phone alerts, repeated the mantra that had become the nation's new oath. We are not what they say we are. We are what we choose to become. But this stance, uncompromising, made him even more dangerous in the eyes of the old order, and the French conspiracy mutated, less visible, more viral, leveraging regional proxies, engineering border disputes, bribing disaffected soldiers, attempting digital coups through manipulated polling data and false flag attacks aimed at discrediting his government. And though he countered each move with resilience, he understood that to survive was not to win. It was merely to hold the line for one more day, one more month, one more storm. And in the fifth and final thrust of this odyssey of resistance, as the dust of betrayal settled into the red earth of his homeland, Traoré began to recognize that his personal survival was inseparable from the spiritual survival of his people, not in the religious sense but in the soul-deep assertion of being, the refusal to let an entire continent be remembered only through the lens of suffering, coups, aid, and war. He sought to ignite what Thomas Sankara once dreamed but never lived long enough to complete. An Africa unafraid to say no, to walk away, to invent again from the ground up. And so in private meetings with other Sahelian leaders, Mali, Niger, Chad, he proposed not just alliances of arms but of media, of schools, of cross-border cultural revival, uniting nomadic traditions, local economies, and digital infrastructures into a framework so decentralized it could not be bought, overthrown, or colonized. And in this, he hoped not only to resist France, but to render them irrelevant. For Traoré had come to learn that true power was, not in fighting the empire head-on, but in building a world where it could no longer breathe, no longer influence, no longer define. And if he were to fall tomorrow, by drone, by dagger, or by deception, he wanted one thing engraved not on his tombstone, but in the minds of every child who survived the years of shadows. That sovereignty was not an act, it was a state of being, and that every time they spoke the truth of their history aloud, every time they planted cassava in land once claimed by outsiders, every time they looked toward the future without begging for validation, they were part of the ongoing, unstoppable fight for survival, not just his but Africa's.